first, Rebecca didn't think much of the glowing light inside the empty house of her neighbors. During this time of year, the Rutherford family, Jason, Justin, and their adopted daughter Susie, would go on holiday in celebration of when they all became a family. Rebecca, having always been closer to her friends than relatives, could relate to the Rutherfords' philosophy that a happy family doesn't have to be made up of blood. This made Rebecca the Rutherfords' most trusted caretaker to look after their other family members who couldn't go on vacation with them, Mario and Luigi, the family's cats. Each of the 3 nights the Rutherfords were gone, Rebecca would check in on the cats at 6 p.m. and give them their wet food.
1/3 of a can for each kitty,
the previous year's note had read, written in big block letters by Susie, the 9-year-old's penmanship getting better and better each time Rebecca saw it.
Cut it like a peace sign,
the child would always suggest in each year's letter. The to-do list always went as follows. Dump the water from the aluminum bowl and refill it with the fresh filtered water from the fridge. Add the necessary amount of dry food to the plastic bowl and stir it so the cats don't try to pick out the fresher pellets. Scoop the litter. Put each cat's wet food on a small plate on opposite ends of the kitchen so that Mario doesn't steal Luigi's supper. Last but not least, give plenty of nuzzles and scratches. The Rutherfords were people who treated their pets as part of the family, and as such, Mario and Luigi were very sociable. Therefore, after Rebecca finished feeding and cleaning the litter, she'd usually end up spending close to 45 minutes playing with the cats. Rebecca took notice of the lights in the Rutherfords' house after having already fed the cats on the first night. She had been over 2 hours earlier and hadn't noticed that any of the lights were on. Admittedly, she had been in a rush that day, having arrived an hour late due to bad traffic, topped off with the difficult day's work. Perhaps she just hadn't observed that the light was on? Despite being exhausted, Rebecca had been observant enough to notice that the Rutherfords still emptied out their cupboards and fridge before going on their trip. Likewise, in keeping with tradition, Susie left the note as always. Rebecca only skimmed the letter this year, being in a rush and all, but she got the gist of it. The only thing different was that both the dry food and water bowls were completely empty when she showed up. The cats must have gotten more of an appetite in their older age. She also heard a lot of meowing, whereas Mario and Luigi had always been relatively quiet. Other than that, nothing else was amiss. So, as Rebecca stared out her window at the light in the supposedly vacant Rutherford house, she thought, maybe I just didn't notice it. After all, it was Memorial Day weekend, and daylight was still quite bright at 6 o'clock during this time of year, so maybe the Rutherfords accidentally left it on, and Rebecca simply just didn't take notice due to the contrast of the vibrant spring day. And that was all Rebecca chalked it up to, making a mental note to ensure that every light was to be checked and turned off when she went over tomorrow. Deep down, Rebecca knew she probably should have just made the trip across the street to turn the light off right then, but she wasn't going to. Walking into a dark, empty house all by herself sent chills up her spine. The light remains on, she decided, until tomorrow. 6 o'clock the next day arrived, and Rebecca hadn't thought about the light at all. The cats will thank me for not leaving them in complete darkness, she told herself as she went to bed the previous night, and then put the thought in the back of her head. It wasn't until she finished with her second round of watching the cats and was on her way out the door that she remembered to turn the light off. As she turned back to check which light was on, she found all of them off. She remained calm despite being creeped out. The temptation to panic was beginning to fester. She thought she could hear her heart pumping faster. It was as if her instincts were trying to tell her, this is indeed something to be concerned about. She was startled by this sound. The unusualness of Mario or Luigi being so talkative got into her head. Maybe something in the house isn't right. Maybe the meowing cat is trying to tell me something. Like, warn me. She slowly walked down the hallway, hoping for one of the switches to be in the on position. None were. Not the dining room light, not the hallway light, not the living room light, not even the light connected to the stairway fan. Without standing around to think about it any longer, she ran out the door, continuing to bolt home, and then locked herself inside. Safe now, she ran up the stairs to the living room window and looked out. For a few minutes, she thought she could hear the meowing of one of the cats. Even as the sound slowly faded, Rebecca continued to stare at the Rutherfords' unlit residence. As she watched the dark house stare back at her, she had called Jason's cell once and Justin's twice. Voicemail each time. A couple of hours later, Rebecca was still looking at the hollow house. It seemed even more sinister at dusk. Then, the Rutherfords' living room window lit up. Now, Rebecca had her own permission to call the cops. The first police car arrived less than 10 minutes after Rebecca dialed 911. She explained to Officer Forrest and Officer Wallace that she was looking after the Rutherfords' cats and that a light kept turning on in the otherwise vacant house. A second patrol vehicle arrived about 3 minutes later. Forrest and Wallace briefed the two officers who had just arrived. After Rebecca made several attempts to call Jason and Justin again, Jason finally called back. Rebecca put him on speakerphone so that the officers could be a part of the conversation. She proceeded to explain to Jason that she thought someone was in his house. She could hear him reply, but his words were blocked by the crackles of a bad signal. "I can barely hear you," Rebecca shouted into the receiver, forgetting that this wouldn't improve Jason's poor reception. Jason, though barely audible, could be heard by both Rebecca and Officer Forrest as saying, "Yeah, whatever you need." That was permission for the police to enter the premises.
"Thank you, Jason," Rebecca said. "Call me when you have better reception."
"Okay," Jason said, and then disconnected after a couple more seconds of annoying static. Rebecca handed Forrest the key. He and the two other officers who had arrived in the second police car went inside the Rutherfords to investigate, while Officer Wallace waited outside with Rebecca. She noticed some of her other neighbors peering out their windows, a few of them even coming outside to watch the show. About 5 minutes went by when a third police car showed up. The two officers from the third car walked around the Rutherfords' property with flashlights, looking for any signs of a burglary. Wallace radioed Forrest, explaining that two other officers were outside checking the yard. "No need," Forrest radioed back, and then exited the house with the two other officers he had gone in with. The light from the living room window remained on. Officer Forrest approached Rebecca and Wallace, while the other four cops dispersed in the vehicles they had arrived in. Forrest smiled, gently placing the key back in her hand. "There's no need to worry about anything, ma'am," he said, still slightly grinning. "We looked through every corner of every room and found nothing suspicious. No sign of a break-in."
"What about the light?" she asked, a bit annoyed. "I watched it turn on."
"Well," Forrest began, then paused for a quick chuckle. "It's on a timer." Even in the cool darkness of the spring night, Rebecca could feel her face blush and small beads of sweat form along her hairline. With the whole neighborhood watching the circus she had created, Rebecca couldn't remember the last time she felt so embarrassed. Lost for words, Rebecca dabbed her forehead with the tips of her fingers and laughed.
"I'm so sorry about all of this."
"Think nothing of it," Forrest replied reassuringly.
"The routine is the same every year," she explained. "They've never had their lights on a timer as long as I've known them, so it never even crossed my mind. I jumped to the most dramatic conclusion." To herself, she thought, had I read Susie's note, it probably would have mentioned the lights were on a timer.
"Most people wouldn't have considered it being on a timer,"
said Officer Wallace.
"I know I didn't. The Rutherfords probably just didn't want their cats to be in the dark all night, but also didn't want to leave the light on all day."
After Rebecca thanked the officers several more times, hoping each acknowledgement would soften the embarrassment, she left a voicemail on Jason's phone and told him it was a false alarm. The next day, Rebecca went over to feed the cats for one last time before the Rutherfords would return from their annual trip the following day. She found it strange that the cats were nowhere to be found.
"All those visitors last night were probably too much excitement for them,"
she thought. So, she filled the dry food and water bowls, which were once again uncharacteristically empty, then scooped the litter and set out the 2 dishes of wet food. During Mario and Luigi's rare bouts of shyness, the clinking of the wet food dishes being set on the kitchen tile was always a way to get them out of their hiding spots. But not today.
I guess the kiddies really didn't like how I handled that situation,
Rebecca told herself as she took one last look around for them. She stumbled on the light timer affixed to one of the switches for the dining room light.
All this due to my ignorance.
Even by herself, she was embarrassed.
I'm never gonna hear the end of this goof.
Just as Rebecca was leaving, her phone rang. It was Justin. She answered.
Hello!
Rebecca, what's wrong?
Jason didn't tell you?
She asked, puzzled.
He said he could barely hear you. His phone gets bad reception and mine doesn't get voicemail out here.
Well,
she began, chuckling in hopes that it would lessen the events of the previous night.
There was a fiesta at your house last night.
Huh?
The dining room light that's on a timer,
Rebecca explained bashfully.
While looking at your house from my house, I saw the light from your dining room switch on. I thought someone was inside, like a burglar or something. So I called the cops, and with Jason's permission, they went inside and looked around.
When Rebecca heard silence, she thought Justin would either hang up or shout at her for causing such a ruckus. After a few seconds, Justin did indeed yell, but not at Rebecca.
Jason, did you set the timer in the dining room?
Rebecca looked closely at the timer and heard Jason's faint
No.
in the background as she realized the timer hadn't been enabled.
I couldn't understand anything she was asking me,
Jason continued.
so I just told her, yeah, whatever you need. Why? What's going on?
At that moment, Rebecca noticed the letter from Susie that she hadn't bothered to read on that first night when she arrived late and rushed. As expected, the instructions were nearly identical to every year's, but it didn't say anything about a light being on a timer, which Rebecca assumed would have settled this whole mix-up.
So the light wasn't on a timer?
Next to Susie's letter was another one that hadn't been there earlier. It was also written in large block penmanship with the same pencil, but this time the letters were in red, and the pencil was soaked in blood. This new letter read,
I was astray, so I crawled into this empty space and made it my home. The rusty lock on the old back door popped open so easily. It was like this house wanted to harbor poor, hungry me. I asked you to feed me, but you only left enough food for Mario and Luigi. Didn't you hear me meow? I'm sorry I didn't say hi to you when you first came over. I was just so nervous because I had never met you. When I saw how nice you were to Mario and Luigi, I was going to come out and surprise you on your next visit. But you ran away before I could even show myself. I really wanted your nuzzles and scratches, so I ran after you. But you went back home and locked me out. I meowed for you at your door for several minutes. Didn't you hear me? Then, as I was out prowling for food, I saw those people coming into my home to take me away to the pound. Why do you like Mario and Luigi, but not me? That made me even angrier and hungrier. So, after those men left, I went back inside to write you this letter and get myself a real meal. Since you didn't feed me, I was starving. This helped me not have to choose. I ate them both.
The letter was still floating in midair as Rebecca was nearing the front door to make her escape. At the entryway, however, Rebecca found 2 sticky gobs of fur, scrambled with crushed feline bones. They hadn't been there when Rebecca entered. Justin was still on the line.
Rebecca? Rebecca?
He called desperately into the receiver. Aside from her screams and pleads for mercy, the only other thing audible was deep,
Unnatural, disturbing, man-made meows.